Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The face at the window. My grandmother's house was old, the kind of place where every floorboard creaked and the windows rattled in the wind. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the tall trees casting long shadows across the yard, even in the middle of the day. I used to love visiting her, despite the eerie isolation of the house. But one summer, something happened that I've never been able to forget. I was staying in the upstairs guest room, which overlooked the backyard. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The window had no curtains, just thin blinds that did little to block out the moonlight. At night, the forest looked like an endless sea of darkness, its edges blending into the shadows of the yard. It started on my second night there. I woke up around 3 a.m., my mouth dry and my heart pounding for no reason. As I reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, I saw it, a face at the window. It was pale and expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door, my eyes locked on the face, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. But the following night, it happened again. This time, I woke to a faint tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. The face was there again, closer now, its features clearer in the moonlight. Its lips were slightly parted, as though it were trying to speak. I bolted for my grandmother's room, waking her with frantic whispers about someone outside. She grabbed a flashlight and followed me back to the guest room, but by the time we got there, the face was gone. The window was closed, the yard below empty. "You're just imagining things," she said gently, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "This house can play tricks on you at night." But I knew it wasn't my imagination. For the rest of my stay, I avoided looking out the window. But on my last night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the blinds just a crack, peeking out into the moonlit yard. The face was there, staring back at me from the edge of the forest. I haven't been back to my grandmother's house in years, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like I'm being watched. And when I look toward the window, I half expect to see it there, waiting. The room with no air. When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it was perfect. It was small, but it was all mine. The building was old, sure, with narrow hallways and the occasional groan of pipes, but it had character. The landlord gave me the usual spiel about the rules, including one that stood out. Don't use the storage room on the 4th floor. "Why not?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "It's locked," he replied curtly. "Old stuff from previous tenants. Nothing you need to worry about." I didn't think much of it. Why would I? It was just a storage room. But over time, I started noticing strange things. The 4th floor was empty. No tenants, no furniture, just a dusty corridor with a single locked door at the end. Whenever I passed by, I felt an odd pressure in the air, like the weight of the atmosphere changed near that door. One night, as I was coming back from a late shift, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the storage room. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it, But once I did, it was impossible to ignore. I stopped, my heart pounding, and stared at the door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on the other side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, before shaking it off and heading to my apartment. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who, or what, was behind that door? The tapping started again the next night. This time, it was louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the door, my skin prickling as I listened. It wasn't just tapping, it was breathing. Slow, labored breaths, as though something inside was struggling to fill its lungs. I stepped back, my stomach churning with unease. The air felt heavier now, the pressure almost unbearable. I hurried back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. The next day, I confronted the landlord. "What's in that storage room?" I demanded. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "There's nothing in there," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Just forget about it." I didn't forget. That night, armed with a screwdriver and a flashlight, I made my way back to the 4th floor. The hallway was silent, the air thick with tension. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. It took me nearly 10 minutes to force the lock open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small, empty room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. But the air, it was suffocating, thick and heavy, like I was trying to breathe underwater. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. That's when I saw it. A chair sat in the center of the room, and on it was a single crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. The words scrawled across the page sent a chill down my spine. "Don't open the door. It lets it out." I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The flashlight flickered, and the air grew even heavier. I couldn't breathe. Something moved in the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting and growing. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in the hallway, gasping for air, the door firmly locked behind me. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. And now, I fear it's no longer confined. The Whispering Grave. The cemetery sat on a hill at the edge of town, its wrought iron gates rusted and overgrown with ivy. No one went there unless they had to. Not because it was dangerous, but because it felt wrong. The air was always colder there, the wind quieter, the silence oppressive. I had always avoided the place, but one night, on a dare, I found myself standing at its gates. My friends laughed as they shoved me forward. "Go touch the old headstone," one of them said, grinning, "the one with the angel." I rolled my eyes, pretending not to care. "Fine," I said, stepping into the cemetery. The gravel path crunched beneath my feet as I walked past rows of weathered tombstones. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint, mournful sound. The angel statue was easy to find. It stood tall and imposing, its wings outstretched, its stone face tilted toward the sky. The name on the grave had been worn away by time, leaving only a faint inscription at the base. "Listen, and you will hear." I hesitated, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The wind stilled, and the air grew colder. For a moment, the world felt frozen. Then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the ground beneath the statue. It was soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder as I leaned closer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice that sounded desperate, pleading. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice continued, growing louder, more frantic. "Please, help me." I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My friends were waiting at the gates, their laughter fading as they saw my pale face. "What happened?" one of them asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering followed me home, filling my room with its desperate pleas. It spoke my name over and over, until I thought I would lose my mind. I've never been back to the cemetery, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper again, faint and distant, as though it's still calling to me from beneath the earth. The man in the woods. I grew up in a small town surrounded by miles of dense forest. Everyone in town had stories about the woods, tales of strange lights, eerie noises, and people who went in but never came out. My parents warned me to stay away, but the woods were too tempting. They felt alive, almost magical, and as a kid I couldn't resist exploring them. One summer, my best friend Liam and I decided to camp out in the woods. We were 16 and thought we were invincible, laughing off the warnings from our parents and the legends whispered around town. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us the night, we set off in the late afternoon, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. We found a small clearing just before sunset and set up camp. The air was cool and quiet, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant calls of birds. We built a fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories until the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest grew dark. It was around midnight when we heard the first sound. A low, guttural noise, like the growl of an animal, echoed through the trees. Liam and I froze, our laughter dying instantly. "Probably just a coyote," he said, though his voice wavered. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. But then we heard it again. Closer this time, and more deliberate. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "Let's check it out," Liam whispered, grabbing his flashlight. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We should stay by the fire." But he was already standing, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Reluctantly, I followed, clutching my own flashlight like a lifeline. We moved cautiously through the trees, the forest eerily silent except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The growling had stopped, replaced by a strange, shuffling sound, like something dragging across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the source of the noise. And then we saw him. A man stood in the shadows, his back to us. He was tall and thin, his clothes tattered and stained with what looked like dirt, or maybe blood. His arms hung limply at his sides, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge us, but the air around him felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "Sir?" Liam called out, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The man's head snapped around, too fast to be human. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and black. A chilling smile stretched across his face, far too wide, as if his skin were being pulled taut. He took a step toward us. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Liam's arm and pulling him back toward the campsite. We sprinted through the trees, our flashlights bouncing wildly, the shadows around us twisting and shifting. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him. His footsteps, impossibly fast and heavy, closing the distance between us. When we reached the clearing, the fire was out, the campsite eerily still. Without stopping, we grabbed our things and bolted back to the trail, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, gasping for air as we stumbled onto the main road. The man was gone, but the feeling of his presence lingered, a cold weight pressing against my chest. I haven't set foot in those woods since that night. Liam moved away the following year, and we never spoke about what happened again. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I think I see him. Standing at the edge of the trees, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. The room beneath the stairs. The house my parents bought when I was 10 was massive, an old Victorian with countless rooms and a basement I swore was haunted. My mom dismissed my fears as an overactive imagination, but the house always felt wrong. Shadows lingered in the corners longer than they should, and the floorboards creaked in ways that didn't match anyone's movements. It wasn't until I was 13 that I discovered the small door beneath the staircase. We had been living there for years, but I'd never noticed it before. The door was tiny, barely big enough for a child to fit through, and it was painted the same color as the wall, blending in almost perfectly. I found it by accident, my foot brushing against a loose floorboard that revealed the edge of the frame. "Mom, did you know there's a door under the stairs?" I asked later that day. She frowned. "No, honey. It's probably just an old crawl space. Don't mess with it." Of course, that only made me more curious. The next day, while my parents were out, I grabbed a flashlight and pried the door open. The hinges groaned as it swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway that sloped downward into darkness. The air that wafted out was cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I hesitated, but my curiosity won out. I crawled through the door, the flashlight's beam illuminating rough stone walls and a dirt floor. The passage twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the end. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a room. The space was small, the walls lined with shelves that held dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on it sat a tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked, its empty eyes staring straight ahead. As I stepped closer, the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, low and insistent, coming from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as the whispering grew louder, filling my ears. I scrambled back up the passageway, the whispers following me, rising to a deafening roar. When I burst into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house. I never opened the door again. My parents sold the house a few years later, and I didn't argue when they said we were moving. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear those whispers, angry, accusing, waiting. The passenger. I was driving home late one night, the highway empty except for the occasional semi-truck roaring past. The stretch of road I was on was notorious for being desolate, with no gas stations or rest stops for miles. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless pavement ahead and the dense woods that lined the road. It was past midnight, and fatigue was starting to set in. I turned up the radio to keep myself awake. humming along to the static-filled music. That's when I saw him. A man was standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in a classic hitchhiker's gesture. He was tall and lanky, wearing a tattered coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood. But something about him made me uneasy. I kept driving, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I passed him. My rearview mirror showed his figure shrinking into the distance, motionless except for his outstretched hand. I shook off the feeling of unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing on the side of the road in the exact same position. Thumb out, hood pulled low. My stomach twisted. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't taken any turns and my car hadn't slowed down. I pressed down on the gas, speeding past him without a second glance. My pulse quickened as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him again. But the road was empty. I tried to focus on the drive, ignoring the sinking feeling in my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head, and my blood ran cold. He was standing on the shoulder, just a few feet from my car, keeping pace with me. His head turned slowly toward me, and though his face was still hidden, I could feel his gaze boring into me. I screamed, slamming my foot on the gas. My car roared forward, and when I looked back, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of panic and adrenaline. When I finally reached my driveway, I jumped out of the car and ran inside, locking every door and window. I stayed up all night, staring at the curtains and waiting for something, anything, to happen. The next morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the road to my front porch. The prints stopped just outside my door. The tunnel. Growing up, there was a storm drain on the edge of town that everyone called the tunnel. It was an old concrete pipe that stretched for miles underground, its entrance overgrown with weeds and graffiti. Kids in my neighborhood dared each other to explore it, but most of us never made it more than a few feet inside. The darkness was suffocating, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. When I was 14, my friends and I decided to explore it for real. Armed with flashlights and a map someone had printed off the internet, we crawled into the tunnel one hot summer afternoon. The air inside was cool and damp, and the sound of our footsteps echoed eerily off the walls. At first, it was exciting. We laughed and joked, our voices bouncing through the narrow space as we followed the winding path. The graffiti on the walls grew stranger the farther we went. Words and symbols that didn't make sense, painted in what looked like rust-colored streaks. Then we found the first shoe. It was lying in the middle of the tunnel, covered in mud and mold. It looked old, but not ancient. Something someone might have worn a few months ago. We exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on, the bravado of the dare keeping us moving forward. The second shoe was farther in, lying on its side near the wall. It was the same size and style as the first, as if they had belonged to the same person. We turned a corner, and the flashlight beams illuminated something that made us all stop. A figure was crouched at the far end of the tunnel, its back to us. Its clothes were filthy and torn, and its shoulders moved in a slow, jerky rhythm, like it was breathing or sobbing. "Hello?" one of my friends called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. Then slowly, it began to turn. We didn't wait to see its face. We ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we scrambled back toward the entrance. The air grew colder as we ran, and I swear I could hear faint whispers following us, growing louder with each step. When we finally burst out into the sunlight, gasping for air, we realized we weren't alone. 2 muddy shoes sat just outside the entrance, neatly placed side by side. The last room. When my grandfather passed away, my family inherited his house. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, filled with antique furniture and creaky floorboards. I loved exploring it as a kid, imagining the kind of life he must have lived in such a grand old house. But there was one room we never opened. The door was at the end of the second-floor hallway, its surface scratched and worn. My grandfather had always kept it locked, and he never talked about what was inside. After his death, my parents told me not to go near it. "It's just storage," they said. "Nothing you need to worry about." One rainy afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. While my parents were sorting through his belongings downstairs, I found the key to the locked room tucked away in a drawer. It was old and heavy, its metal tarnished with age. The door creaked as I turned the key, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. The room beyond was dark, the air stale and heavy. I flicked on my flashlight, illuminating a small empty space. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. At first I thought the room was completely empty, but then I saw it. A mirror propped against the far wall. Its surface was cloudy and cracked, the silver backing peeling away in places. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and warped in the cracked glass. As I reached out to touch it, my flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something else. It wasn't my reflection. The figure in the mirror was taller, its face obscured by shadows. Its head tilted slowly, and its hand reached up, pressing against the glass from the other side. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as the air grew colder. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I pounded on the door, screaming for my parents, but the handle wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. A faint tapping on the mirror, slow and deliberate. When the door finally opened, I bolted into the hallway, my heart racing. My parents found me trembling on the stairs, unable to explain what had happened. We sold the house a few months later, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I feel like I'm not alone. Like there's something or someone watching me from the other side.